So, because the reason that I was thinking about basil internally is because I was thinking brain,
Yeah, I mean,
which like
in
cognitive.
in increasing the cognitive function is good. The thing that I like to target with that is you remember the astral projection blend?
Yeah.
Do the Moses technique, and part of what that does with that, and you can just do the regular version, like heart, navel,
Mm-hmm.
crown, or back heart, navel, and crown is actually a little better. Um, that actually hits the thalamus and which is this like processing center in the brain. And um, when you hit that combined with the arms and legs, it significantly reduces dissociation. Significantly. The thing with astral projection, that blend, is it generates movement out of the emotional patterns. And so what starts to happen is, even in the emotional body, we get like these loops, like how like you get a repetitive thought in your mind, we get these repetitive emotions that are tied to physiological functions. Sometimes they'll say lower emotions. In the old days, we used to call them homeostatic emotions, or homeostatic responses, I think maybe is what we used to say. And those can have a loop as well. And the emotional, or excuse me, the astral projection generates movement where you almost like walk away from those emotional patterns. And so, sometimes the pattern might be like anger, or it might be sadness, or it might be fear. And so what happens is, because that emotional pattern's there, they don't do this consciously, right? So there's no talking them out of this. Like it's part of an emotional pattern. But what starts to happen is they start creating situations for that emotion to manifest. So you get somebody who's really angry. um they'll create situations where they can really be angry, right? Or if
Mm-hmm.
somebody's feeling hurt or sad, they'll create situations where they really can feel the sadness or the hurt. And they're not doing it consciously. It's actually um it's partially physiology and partial like emotional, just these emotional patterns. And astral projection is it's not that it breaks down the patterns, it's like you outgrow the patterns. Like you just go, yeah, I'm not doing that anymore. Like it's not like you're breaking it down and releasing it. You're like, that was so last year. Like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's like they move past her, they grow past it, because astral projection is like a kind of expansion. And so what you're expanding the emotions out of the emotional pattern. And then at some point they just go, yeah, that's kind of boring. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's golden. Like if you can get somebody there, that's golden, because they'll continue to work and walk away from that pattern way beyond the healing. And so, you know, each person's a little bit different, because you come to each situation, and people have different upbringings, have different genetics, they have different viewpoints on how these things go down. They might be more in their head or more in their body, and so you get a feel for the client, and then you kind of realize, like, okay, this is I can focus more on energetics, or I can focus more on the emotion, or man, like it's a bunch of repetitive things in their head that keeps generating the emotion, because that can also happen. But usually with like when they've had the background that you're talking about with abuse and things, it's usually in instinctive responses, which is down in the sex chakra and the navel, right? For that particular situation, more sex chakra than anything, and then the solar plexus. And so by working that pattern of the sex, heart, throat, crown, or the backside, anytime you work the heart, it manually makes the solar plexus release, and
Mhm.
the heart will transmute the emotional pattern, where the solar plexus, like you go through and clean it up and it's good, but until the solar plexus gets really I don't know the right word, let's say regulated, um it feels alive by the ups and downs. It doesn't really care that, hey, this is a good feeling or a bad feeling. It just likes the roller coaster ride. Like it just likes the roller coaster. And as much as you clean the solar plexus, which it needs to be clean, but it will clean it up. But all you're doing is cleaning it up for another day at the park, riding the roller coaster. You know what I mean? It's like, oh boy, that was a rough one. Clean me up so I can go ride again. Right?
Mhm.
Activating the heart starts to even out the solar plexus and regulate the solar plexus and makes the solar plexus let go of some of these things. That's why, like when people get in relationships and they start to fall in love, the heart gets activated, and then all of a sudden they start fighting like cats and dogs, or all these fears come up, or they start talking about the past. Is in that time the heart gets activated, and then the solar plexus starts to release, and all their baggage starts coming out. And so usually at some point, when two people are starting to engage a relationship, you can almost tell that it's more genuine. This sounds really weird, but it's because they have like some weird conflict that goes on, like some unresolved something, or they're in some area where they're not getting along. It's not because they don't like each other, it's happening because they like each other, and the heart activating makes it come to the surface. And so knowing that, if you can just spend time activating the heart, the emotional component will diminish. The ajna and the crown need to be cleaned up quite a bit, for like in those abuse kinds of things, for the repetitive thinking and stuff. The throat is actually a lot of the repetitive thought, but the throat is still a reflection of the crown. And so you, even when you clean the throat, you clean it up, but again, it just goes, okay, you know, the solar plexus likes the up and down. The throat likes the merry-go-round. Like it just likes to spin. Like, oh my God, it loves to spin. Repetitive thought, repetitive thought, repetitive thought, repetitive thought. What about this? What about that? Repetitive thought. And so by cleaning the crown, you kind of pull them off the merry-go-round. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Um,
And some people will say, "Oh, it's the crown. You don't need to clean it." Some traditions say, "Oh, you don't have to clean the crown. It's the crown. It's the entry point for divine energy." The crown's usually filthy. Like it's not filthy like the way your lower centers are, but there's a lot of um, mm, there's a lot of like kind of a contamination of sorts that the crown will need to have cleaned up. It's almost like it's a byproduct of the lower centers. The lower centers are really like unregulated and not that clean. The crown is going to be not that clean. Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah.
Going back to the dissociation, because really the main perpetrator, if we're going to call out a perp in this whole scenario, the main, it's the basic chakra. Like the
Yeah.
basic chakra is like, so a lot of times If you look at like when you're working on somebody and the crown just won't activate, it's not a crown issue, it's actually a basic issue. And if you clean up the basic, the crown opens up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah,
Like I
thank you.
always like think of
And
it like,
then,
you know how we think about things like, oh, let's do this technique or that technique. And even like what I'm just saying, like, oh, do this transmutation process, do that transmutation process. That's all good. But you know, when you start using intuition, it turns into more like tracking an animal, like through the forest, rather than I'm going to do this technique to you know produce this result for this person. It stops about trying to be making something happen, and it's like you're either tracking dysfunction or you're tracking like the good side of them that you're trying to get them to be able to get back into alignment with. But so it's almost like you're constantly adjusting and adapting and evaluating whatever is presented in front of you. And if you do that, even if you do repetition for a while, like I mean, I had patients where I did, you know, techniques trying to get them to feel better, but knowing that like if I went like into what I was just talking about, they would have freaked out. Like there's no way they weren't ready for that kind of a shift. So
mhm,
I would do healings on them. I would try to get them to feel better, but sometimes like I had a few where it was 5 or 6 years, and then they would go, okay, you know what, I think I'm ready. And then we'd get busy and they would make a lot of progress in a short amount of time. But had they not had that time of wrestling with it, it's almost like sometimes people want relief. I will say that people want relief, but people's perceptions of what's going to bring them relief is usually the bigger foe or the bigger obstacle than them, you know, not making effort or not wanting to get better or not being aware. It's just like preconceived ideas. And in trying to help somebody work through something like that, at some point they have a realization and they have a belly full of what's going on. And they're just like, you know what, I'm done. You know, help me with this. And
mhm.
when you get them like that, oh, they take off. But you know, they really heal very, very rapidly. But it's like if they're not in that place and they're really stuck in the intellect, you almost have to go in and dance with them in the intellect and then slowly walk them out because they're not going to just make the leap. So you just have to get in and go, okay, if this is how we're going to do it, we're going to do it this way for a little bit. And then just little by little keep walking them towards more of those intuitive processes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know this is really
Um,
vague, but I mean,
no, it's
if you're
and it
problem
makes
solving,
sense. Yeah.
that's kind of what you're
Yeah.
doing is
Yeah. And I say
you
that even,
almost have to start with them where they're at and then work them out from there instead of going, okay, this is what we're going to do, you know, because having a preconceived idea usually doesn't get very far. Like they don't stay, you're not seeing something accurate. It's a good place to start sometimes just to get a little dynamic going, but um adapting each each person's like approach. You know, people are in very, very, very different places sometimes, you know.
mm,
I mean, you
yeah.
probably have even heard me like think of the org programming class. Sometimes people would ask me a stack for like
Mm-hmm.
the same thing, and I gave completely different answers. It's because
Mm-hmm.
each person was needing something different. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Even though
so,
even
and
though the
so,
issue's the same, they're
Yeah,
just
but
in
each one
different
has their
places.
own.
Yeah.
And so one of my things about that is because really with this particular person came up like the idea of, using the oils internally.
Hmm.
So it's different when I'm telling somebody, do this pattern or use this oil on your body or whatever it may be. But when it's internal, how do you work with that? Like, are there some sort of like interactions with stuff that they're already taking? Is it probably like that's my
Usually the
that's what I'm
stuff
kind of
that
wondering.
I talk about taking internal, because not all oils should be taken internal. And so, there's that
Right.
list of in the front of the booklet that kind of has a list of
Yeah, yeah.
um, um I made that list because I mean pretty much those are not going to interact with medications. And so you could kind of use
Okay.
that as like a guideline. Um, and so the things that I'd always be careful of are, I mean, St. John's wort, I think might be in there. St. John's wort, if you take a big enough dosage, it will drain medications out of somebody. And then grapefruit doesn't really
Yes, you
interact
mentioned that.
with, yeah, with allergy medicine or cardiovascular, certain cardiovascular meds. And so, other than that, as long as it's something that could be taken internal, you're probably okay.
Okay.
Especially we're doing really relatively small dosage. And
Okay.
so, you know, in extreme cases, the dosage is substantially bigger, and that's when it starts to become. That's why I don't even talk about that even on the Zoom. Like I
Mm-hmm.
just, 1 to 3 drops.
Yeah.
Even if they make a mistake,
Yeah.
most of it's going to be a bad taste in their mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so for that, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you mentioned to do the Moses with the astral projection, so just even have that as I'm working on her, like later through that, and I can even do like some pH while she does that as well, or even
Yeah.
just by itself.
Like if you were going to start with somebody like this, I might not start off with astral projection. I would probably start off with like tarragon or like lang lang, like you were saying, like things that are just
Okay.
kind of soothing, benzoin, kind
Yeah.
of soothe them for a little bit and just get things feeling a little better. And then little by little, I'd start working in
Yeah.